Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episode 3 and 4. So, reasonably within this review, I honestly would say for these two episodes, reasonably, I think the easy reason why I'm going into doing and reviewing two episodes back to back is because both of these feel very much like a filler-like variety of episodes. Reasonably, there isn't much of real backstory we really learn from any of the characters. Basically, it really comes down to within these episodes being like someone has a secret and someone has to let you know what that secret is. So basically, we've kind of learned that through every episode, that ultimately, whatever you're going to be expecting in one episode, the very next episode, you're going to get the exact same thing, but done from a different perspective. It seems to be that is the pattern out of four episodes that I've noticed. It seems like ultimately we have it to where within episode one, we have it being very much a main focal pointed thing on Damien, which is kind of thoroughly as much as possible telling you as much as they can about Damien in one episode. And then the next episode, of course, they focus on the other sibling, Santana. And then so within these other two episodes, and I'm going to talk about these still cryptically here. I won't get into spoilers until I dust out that double five, and then otherwise go into spoilers about each one of these episodes. Within these two episodes, someone has a secret, and so eventually that secret will eventually get unveiled, and otherwise prevail to show you, hey, this person is now opening up to this person about this, or ultimately they end up stumbling upon it because ultimately they can decipher and or figure out without a doubt what exactly this person does. So, going into this show, we have a lot of moments within this show that is kind of very much alluding to still a character on the horizon that is going to be the big threat of the show within two episodes, but realistically it just kind of doesn't really, like, I would love an actual fight scene, but instead it's just like basically saying, hey, yeah, I'm here on this show, just letting you know, but then I'm gonna walk away and see you later. It's like, huh? I'm like, that seems like an odd approach to a lot of this show, because ultimately no one's gonna find anything out. Nobody's gonna. In four episodes, we have yet to see one real action sequence going on in this show, and I think we never will. Ultimately, this show really is not holding itself throughout the processes of these episodes to go more dipping into magic, because ultimately the show isn't dipping into magic. It's not dipping into it's not dipping into anything very all that much. Like we're kind of slowly but surely giving you something that ultimately is just gonna be like, man, like, get to the point already. Like it's gonna be five episodes via the next time I review this, and I think episode 5 is really gonna be make or break, because realistically it needs to be to a point where, like, okay, this show needs to give me something to make me really want to invest in, because out of four episodes, you really have one episode that's like, oh, hey, these characters give me backstory. I like that. But anything in between is just kind of like, okay, like, you only have 10 episodes to give me something. And, and you spend 3 just kind of at a very slow start where you're just kind of like, where you're like revving, like starting to rev the engine, and it's sputtering until eventually you get it to where it's still just sputtering, and it's not like, maybe you got the engine like roaring maybe once, but then that's it. So it's what this show has been so far. By filler episodes, very much uneventful, very much to the point where I was like, I kind of want these episodes just on as background noise. Like, just kind of get through them and just not really watch them, just kind of hear what's going on. But, like, I really tried to just, like, cement and just be like, okay, like, I want to know what happens. So, if anything, if there was, like, some details that I'm foggy upon these episodes, it's really just because there was nothing that was there that ultimately I could break down like these two episodes in like less than 5 minutes. Just say, hey, yeah, in this episode and this happens and done. And fourth episode, this happens and done, because everything else is just filler. So let's fill our way to ultimately go out of our way to spoil these two episodes. Let's break out that double 5 time territory, because yeah, there's not much to ultimately talk about this show cryptically, because there's not much going on in this show at all for these last two episodes. I say last two, but ultimately I'm going to give the fifth one last just make or break, and maybe hopefully by then a lot of people will want me to finish up the show, or a lot of people might just be like, yeah, like the show just, or a lot of people might like watch all the way through the show and then like, dude, it gets really good at like episode 8. And I'm like, dude, episode 8, really? Like, so it gets really good towards the very last ditch effort, or the last episode gets really good, surprisingly, because ultimately this show might just be exactly like Cloak and Dagger was. Because Cloak and Dagger, like, basically it starts out just kind of like flat, and then like it gives you a little bit of backstory, but it's still like a flat show. But then the very last like 1 or 2 episodes really pick up, and they're like, oh man, like there's a huge event going on. You gotta wait to watch these last couple episodes. And I'm like, oh wow, yeah, these last episodes are really interesting, but why do we have to go through the murky waters of boatloads of nothing to get to this point? So let's ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, in episode 3, we ultimately get to the aspect of, in the early episode of this, we have seemingly another monster killing people. Okay, sure. Another monster that we have to assume is probably Damien and Santana's father. That's what we're assuming. So, when going into this episode, we ultimately are rearing our ugly head to eventually see that ultimately Santana had done some good in ultimately awakening her mother. And so Damien is ultimately going to Santana and saying, oh my god, whatever you did to mother like really showed some real true progress, and maybe the demon is just weakening, and so maybe we could just start to slowly but surely pull this demon out, as if like we're taking this demon as if it's some kind of like table covering that has all kinds of like plates and food and all kinds of sort under it, and we're gonna take that table sheet and thrust it out from underneath the table and still have all of the stuff standing and be like perfectly fine at all the end of this, which it's not going to end up that way. It just won't. Have you ever seen a supernatural show where it ends up that everything is completely all right in the end? Because no, it ends up that there ends up being that like, oh yeah, hey, yeah, we made a deal with the devil, and reasonably we're immediately assuming that he's not going to have anything to forcibly make us do any kind of projects. It just feels like we just signed away our souls for nothing. That isn't that great? And then all of a sudden the devil pops up and he's like, yeah, I got a job for you. And they're like, dang it, no. That's usually how a lot of supernatural shows go. So let's go into, yeah, so we have it to where Damien is desperately asking Santana to come with him to talk to Victoria more, because it seems like she is opening up to Santana more than Damien, which is like, yeah, you, Damien, you're not going to get a babysitter to the big old for you. It's not going to happen that way. Damien, this is for you. Not so much. So we have it to where, and ultimately, if you don't know what that reference is, it's from the movie The Omen. More than likely, probably bizarrely, the trailer will ultimately showcase that moment, which is freaking weird, but showcases it. So Damien is begging Santana to go and see her mother, and so Santana does so, and ultimately, again, weirdly enough, Damien is having these moments with his mother that is reflecting upon their past. The only thing is, it doesn't really seem like some of the stuff seems to be coherent. Supposedly talking about playing in the snow, and ultimately Damien is asking, well, hey, maybe at some point, maybe we can build a snowman and yeah, just have some fun. Because ultimately, it's like, dude, it's not winter. But whatever, I guess. So we ultimately have it to where it seems as if on the surface that Victoria is playing ball. Because I think for some reasons or not, she's trying to win people over. She's trying to make it seem like she is a participant in civilization to otherwise be processed back in the world for a bizarre means to eventually get right back into that mental hospital. So ultimately, we have it within this episode that is the beginning of the episode, and then eventually we have it to where Damien ultimately has to get a call to go out to some woman's home, and eventually Damien and Santana both go to this home, and ultimately it seems like Santana is getting some odd vibes with this home, and ultimately she is starting to see some visions, she is starting to feel things within this home, and so ultimately Damien is just asking this girl questions. It seems like everything's copacetic, but not everything is quite copacetic with Santana ultimately grabbing this girl's arm and like asking her, it's like, who are you? Like, what? Why are you doing this? Because ultimately it seems like this girl is really sketchy, but at the end of the day, there are reasons for that. There's a pretty interesting reason for that. So ultimately they get thrusted upon out of this house because ultimately the homeowner ends up pulling a gun on them, and so they end up having to just be like, whoa, okay, we weren't expecting that, so eventually they leave. So they end up having it to where it seems that caretaker is ending up going to the kind of head manager of this mental hospital, which I'm consistently calling June now because that is her real actress's name. Because ultimately, I still haven't really gotten to figure out what her actual name is in this movie. I don't think it's ever going to come up because it won't. So June ultimately is with caretaker, and it seems like they are by and large just kind of like, hey, it's been a while, so ultimately they are just kind of like connecting to one another. They are reasonably wanting to like I think there's a very much like love interest brewing there, because ultimately we have Caretaker that is very much going, it's like, well, hey, it seems like this woman's lonely, I'm lonely, why don't we not be so lonely together? So eventually we get to the aspect of, at some point, to where ultimately within this episode that Santana is ultimately within these episodes, we consistently have it to where it seems that Santana is consistently asking Gabriella, basically like poking kind of the bear about Gabriella's religion. It seems like she's really starting to like ask like how celibate is celibate, and how like it like is like Santana like wanting to make a move, or is it again that she is just kind of poking at the bear, knowing full well that she probably can assume that Gabriella is really fascinated with Damien, and it seems that Damien and Gabriella seem at a lot of points to seemingly at some points be inseparable. And so ultimately within this episode, we have Caretaker and June ultimately going into now having Victoria seemingly be able to be transited to a either different portion of this mental hospital or a different facility altogether, to where it seems that June and Caretaker have to sign in to another place to ultimately get to see Victoria, to ultimately talk to her. It seems like a lot of the times in which like they are starting to just like ask her questions, I think June is really wanting to maybe get a consensus of who Victoria is, who the real her is, and ultimately it seems that Victoria is willing to give up that information. It seems like she's willing to give us a story about her previous life and not Victoria's life, the demon's life, and ultimately how she had children and stuff along those lines. Ultimately, like basically, the demon is basically mentioning to June that her and June are almost one and the same. It's just that basically Victoria's demon ended up being dead. So, going into this, we have it to where at some point there was a fight out between a doctor and a patient, which ultimately led in, like, I think June getting knocked down and Caretaker ending up having to take care of very much this seemingly mental patient-ish like person, knocking June down, also knocking down some medicine that she had with her. So ultimately, it seems like this episode is a much more heavier Caretaker episode, quasi for the most part, because you still have some dipping of Santana and Damien at points, but seems much more like a Caretaker heavy episode. It seems like we slightly, and I mean slightly, have a Gabriella episode via the next episode. So, kind of like what I had mentioned, how basically within each episode we are probably going to have more of a focus on every single character leading up to like pretty much what I'm saying is basically exactly what is coming true within this show. So it kind of feels right now like kind of like a paint by numbers kind of approach to this, going, oh, okay, well, every single episode is just going to lead to us having too much focus on realistically too many people, and then they're probably going to add somebody along the way to ultimately add to the rest of this episode. So we're probably going to have 10 different people have 10 different stories, and then it's just going to lead to probably the ending episode where it's mostly going to get focused on the dad, the monster, and probably his journey to ultimately be death, to be killed, to be deaded, to be gutted and killed. So, yeah, episode 10, or episode 10, episode 3 here. Caretaker eventually picks up the medicine that June knocks over and realizes what it is. So basically, we have June who has to confess to Caretaker, okay, well, yeah, that medicine was mine, and ultimately, yeah, I'm dealing with cancer, and ultimately, she evidently is dealing with lung cancer because ultimately she was a smoker. So ultimately, Caretaker is like, well, hey, like, you know what? Like, if this is going to happen to you, it's like, well, you know what? Like, I can take care of you. If anything, like, I think that, like, you and me could really work together. And ultimately, like, Caretaker's asking June, it's like, well, hey, are you going to get treatment? And ultimately, June says no. She's like, you know what? I'm so tired. Like, I'm so burnt out on everything. And, like, reasonably to probably get to the point to where she is, to where, like, where at probably a snap of the finger, she could probably get killed by any of these demonic like patients, or who knows, there could be any number of kind of supernatural Esh like characters that come on in and just do a little dance, make a little love, get down tonight, if you know what I mean. So June is ultimately just kind of telling Caretaker, it's like, you know what, I've had enough. Like, I've had a long enough life, and I think I'm just gonna kind of sail away on this and just kind of taper off. So Caretaker is just kind of like appreciating her wishes, and so basically that is what kind of eventually ends up to where June eventually talks to Victoria about her previous life, and how she, of course, seemingly is very similar to June in a lot of ways, but ultimately we have it within this episode that really they have to eventually go back into this home that ultimately they had previously went into, because there is still something inside that home. And so eventually Damien and Gabriella try to re-enter the home, and we eventually find out that it seems that the woman that was actually in the home wasn't the actual person of who she said she was. Ultimately, this woman is possessed and has a demon inside her. The only thing is, like, it's basically a relative of hers. It's basically her sister. So ultimately, when looking at it, like, you can tell the difference between the one woman and her sister demon, and to the point where ultimately they are trying to talk down this demon, and ultimately they are trying to reason with it, and eventually it gets down to the point where this demon starts lighting this house on fire, and so ultimately they end up having to forcibly exorcise this demon, and ultimately end up having to forcibly, like, go, okay, hey, you're exercised, let's get out of this house. So recently, that's kind of all that really goes bump in the night within this episode. I think towards the very tail end of this episode, we ultimately have Santana, who ultimately ends up meeting supposedly the big bad of this show, who ultimately just kind of says hello and then just kind of tapers off. Other than that, it's just kind of like that's all that kind of really happens within this episode. It's kind of just not a lot of details, I realize, but I apologize because recently, like, these episodes were kind of they didn't have much going on. So let's go on to talk about episode 4. So if the secret in episode 3 was that ultimately June had cancer and now she's finally talking about it, that it's a pre-existing thing, she went to the doctor, she knows all about it, this and that. Now, within this episode, there is yet another secret to be unfolded, because ultimately, we have it to where Damien doesn't really quite know something about some certain character. So, and we also get to know what happened to freaking Chris Yen like a billion episodes ago, where ultimately he was a man that killed another man and then eventually had a skull bite his arm and then ran off. Like, we don't actually get to know what happened to Chris Yen, but we get to know that they actually give a crap about what happened to him. Such a stupid thing. So, instead of trying to retrieve said Chris Yen, instead they just have a entire episode retracing his tracks, and like that's all that really happens, and they end up kind of like cleaning up after him. So, and that's really the main focus. But we also have a thing about Gabriella kind of going on, to where ultimately in the very beginning of this episode we have Gabriella who is in confessional, and ultimately it seems that she is starting to have questions about things. She is starting to really go into this confessional, and like there isn't much to confess. It's just that she has feelings towards people, and like she's trying to go to this guy for answers. And recently within this preacher, he's like, well, yeah, but it doesn't really seem like anything that you're really actually saying like is an actual sin of any kind. Like, there's not much that I can repent you for if there's not much of any sin going on. And so ultimately, this priest eventually goes to Gabriella and mentions that he likes girls like her, and then eventually he crashes his way through to her and tries to attack her. And so, like, basically, it ends up fast forwarding within this episode to go back to some certain information leading up to some certain point. But I'll kind of tell you the aftermath that happens to Gabriella, and then I'll kind of like taper back at some moments or this and that. But ultimately, a bulk of this is just going to be like the main focus on certain things, and maybe some of the talking points are just kind of like blah 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 whatever. So we ultimately have it to where Caretaker ends up meeting with Gabriella and ends up knocking down this priest, ultimately ending up taking and putting a seemingly token in this guy's mouth and making him swallow it. Basically making him choke on it, and basically ending up like killing this said demon. And because ultimately, like, Gabriella asked if it's some certain kind of just coin, and he's like, no, it's not a coin, it's a token. There's a difference. There's a real, true, big, huge difference, I guess. So, anyways, we have within this episode to be where the heck is Chris Yen Ben? And so reasonably, we have Damien, who is finding out what Santana actually does for a living. Eventually going to her place of business and then ultimately asking her, it's like, dude, how much really is a lot of this stuff kind of worth? Immediately, he is trying to price some of the stuff himself, and immediately he's just saying, like, yeah, this is probably a couple $1,000. And she's like, try a couple $1,000,000. And he's like, holy crap, how is it that you've, like, done so well? And, like, I would just be asking him, like, hey, how about you slide some money my way? Like, how about a cool $1,000,000? I'd appreciate that. But because ultimately Damien is just a teacher and he's getting by a teacher's salary and this and that. So Damien ends up very much being it to where Santana is very much wanting to seemingly spend even more time with Damien, to the point to where ultimately Santana had changed hotels or changed rooms, rooms, and ultimately she went to Damien and said, "Hey, like, hey, do you want to just kind of hang out and whatever?" And ultimately, Damien is like, "Well, don't you have some kind of 5-star hotel to go to?" And she's like, "Well, hey, yeah, like, if anything, like, I'm waiting on my room to be prepared for me, so." Ultimately, like, I thought I would just kind of stick around here until, like, my room is prepared for me, because ultimately I had to change rooms. So, like, there's some kind of really nice moments in these 2 episodes that I kind of thought was kind of really nice and this and that, but ultimately it's just a lot of just really really just kind of like, okay, let's get to the meat and potatoes of these episodes. So we ultimately have it to where, again, Santana and Damien are at this factory of artifacts, and so reasonably they end up finding a dead body within this place. And Santana doesn't have it, no, never mind, and she's not shocked or whatever. They end up playing back the footage, and ultimately, Santana says that Yen probably assumed that the person that was in this room being attacked by Yen was probably just some thief or some thug or something like that, and so he probably had to take him out. Ultimately, knowing full well, the more and more, like, Santana talks about her job, the more, like, sketchy it is, to where he's not 100% buying that all that she's doing all the live long is just selling these expensive items. There's got to be more to this. And because eventually there's a lot of dead bodies that Santana is just like, dead bodies are lining up, and Santana is just like, nah, whatever. Like, it's just another day. I gotta go ahead and clean up, and yet another dead body. And so Damien is watching this and seeing this and noticing this, and he's like, okay, what are you and Yen really doing? Because there's some kind of, like, there's something weird about this. And so Santana has to confess to Damien that ultimately Yen has been helping her kill people. So ultimately she can, of course, succubus them up. And so Damien is like, oh my god, you're killing people? Because ultimately, Damien had thought that maybe Santana had been able to work through some of her problems, and maybe that this was one of them, but I guess not so much. So Santana has very much told told Damien her game plan, and it kind of comes out to be like, it kind of sounds to me like kind of like a very much Dexter-esque like approach, that ultimately the reason why she can kind of sleep at night is just the fact that ultimately Santana tells Damien that she only kills bad people, people that would otherwise kill others. And that is the reason why she ultimately does the thing that she does. Every kill is justifiable, every kill has to have evidence that these people had done these crimes. So it kind of, to me, kind of feels like a Dexter kind of approach to this show, with Santana just sucking the life out of people instead of with Dexter. Dexter would just stab people in the heart after wrapping them in all kinds of plastique or bubble wrap or whatever the heck he had on him, to make sure that none of the blood would spill all over the place. So, because ultimately I had seen that show. Eventually, I'm probably going to have to re-review that whole thing going on. I'm probably going to have to start eventually going into reviewing Dexter, because I actually really love that show. But I'd also heard that Dexter is supposedly going to be getting a revival pretty soon. So, like, I think at some point I really want to start chipping away at the show Dexter, and maybe through episode to episode start reviewing it, because I actually really enjoy that show. So, let's go into more of this review. So, reasonably, this episode just kind of breaks down as the confessional between Santana and Damien, and reasonably it ends up kind of being that there is a kid that otherwise ends up being possessed by a monsterish like being, and it ends up that seemingly simultaneously Damien and Santana both are trying to work this guy at the same time, and Santana touches this guy or Damien touches this guy to get the demon out, as Santana tries to almost like suck the demon out of this person. Here's one thing that kind of fascinates me, is that we ultimately get the knowledge of Caretaker telling us that ultimately the exorcist like processes of the approach of this show. So what happens is that ultimately it seems like whenever Damien is trying to exorcise a demon to come out of someone's body, it honestly kind of feels like a moot point or a waste of time, because what ends up happening is that the demon doesn't end up like going back to hell, and that's exactly where he's gonna go. What ends up happening is that the demon ends up just becoming free. Yeah, the person who gets possessed is away from the demon, but when also looking at it, the demon could easily go back into that same possessed person, repossess them, and this starts all over again. And so basically, a lot of this possession nonsense is really just kind of a moot point. Anytime for Damien to really just exercise somebody, like, there needs to be a much more lethal, like, one and done option, because ultimately, how many much more demons are going to be possessed inside people's bodies to where, like, there's an entire world of possessed demons that are all inside people's bodies, to the point where eventually Damien and Santana are going to completely become outnumbered. So, reasonably within this episode, yeah, there's not much going on. Reasonably, they eventually see footage of Damien attacking somebody, and then eventually all while cleaning some of the blood up, and then eventually, like, kind of cleaning up after Yen. Eventually, Yen's boyfriend ends up showing up and basically demanding to know exactly where Yen went. And basically, Santana completely comes off the cuff with an entire excuse mentioning exactly where Yen is, and that he had went off to do um, some adjustments in some other factory somewhere. And ultimately, Yen's boyfriend is starting to get really tired of this. That ultimately, it seems that Yen is completely putting his work before him, and ultimately Santana is coming up with all of this story right out of her butt, and I'm just impressed. Like, I'm just like, man, this all seems very true and authentic, and nothing seems stumbled, nothing seems fumbled, and like, it really seems like she's been doing this for I don't know how long now, to where it seems authentic, and so everyone believes it, to the point where even Damien is impressed about how, like, she could BS her way through talking to this guy and he believed it. Really, again, showcasing how scary Santana could honestly be. So ultimately, Yen's boyfriend ultimately is telling, it's like, well, hey, like, if this guy keeps choosing his job instead of me, like, then ultimately, you can tell Yen that ultimately, like, maybe he needs to look for another boyfriend, and so Yen's boyfriend leaves. Again, Damien was impressed about Santana's lies, and ultimately, we have it to where Santana is mentioning how basically that Yen really needs to get an upgrade, a boy upgrade, because it's like, if anything, if anybody can believe the bullshit that Santana's saying, it's like, maybe there is a problem with that guy. But yeah, so reasonably within this episode, like, there is not much going on with much of these episodes. And really, I think the whole thing with Santana and Damien finding Yen was the big thing in this episode, and the big reveal of the secret of Santana telling Damien the truth. But other than that, there wasn't much really vitally important going on into this episode that felt relevant enough, to be brutally honest. So yeah, me kind of rushing through this review much more so compared to other things, but yeah, those are the vital important things that happened in this episode. But I think other than that, I think I'm going to go here. Some interesting things at some points, but really, it's just, come on now, come on already, come on. You've given us 4 episodes. You've got to get your motor running and really start to go, okay, like here is the point now where you can just be like, yeah, this is where I'm gonna get my money's worth now of me watching this for so long. So at the end of the day, I think that's all I want to say for this review. I apologize again if not heavily detailed within this review. I kind of bashed this one much more so than a lot of other ones. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.